A poor maid, with nothing in her hands but the truth, yet that truth was powerful enough to overturn an entire trial and save a mafia boss from life imprisonment. She knew how insignificant she was, and she knew full well that stepping into that room meant placing herself directly in danger. But she went anyway, because she had seen the man he truly was with her own eyes, and because standing on the side of justice was something woven into her very flesh and blood. Once before in her life, she had found the courage to speak up for what was right, and she'd paid far too high a price for that choice. Yet now, standing once again at the boundary between safety and danger, she still chose to do the right thing, as though she'd been born for precisely that purpose. Before we begin, please tell us in the comments where you're listening from, and when the story ends, don't forget to give it a score from 0 to 10. We hope you enjoy the story. The air inside the courtroom of the Chicago Federal Court was so thick it felt as though it could be sliced into pieces. Lucian Moretti, 34 years old, and the leader of one of the most powerful families in the city, sat with his back perfectly straight before the dock, and in only 30 minutes, he could lose everything. The defense chair beside him was empty. Elias Ward, the celebrated attorney who hadn't lost a single case in 20 years, had failed to appear. There'd been no message, no explanation. He'd simply vanished at the precise moment Lucian's fate was about to be decided. The judge brought down the gavel, his voice as cold as steel. "Mr. Moretti, you have exactly 5 minutes to present your defense counsel. Otherwise, this court will pronounce sentence." The prosecutor smiled like a man who'd already won. And then, at that exact moment, the side door burst open. Or rather, it was assaulted by a whirlwind in human form. A young woman came rushing inside, her case of documents flying through the air as sheets of paper rained down across the aisle. The entire courtroom froze, then erupted into laughter. But the young woman rose to her feet, adjusted the glasses that had slipped crookedly across the bridge of her nose, and in her eyes, though no one had yet noticed it, burned a determination as hard as iron. If you're finding this story compelling, please leave a like to support us. Don't hesitate to share this video with others who love captivating stories as much as you do, and remember to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of the fascinating stories still to come. The young woman rose to her full height, and though her cheeks still burned from the laughter rolling through the gallery, her voice cut clean across the room. "I am not a lawyer," she said, and the simple honesty of it made a few of the reporters stop typing. "My name is Cora Bennett, and I am a witness. I have evidence, physical evidence, directly connected to this case, and I am asking this court for the chance to present it." For a heartbeat nobody moved. Prosecutor Silas Crane, bald head gleaming under the fluorescent lights, let out a laugh that was more bark than amusement. "Your Honor, this is a federal courtroom, not an open microphone night. A woman falls through the door, spills her lunch across the aisle, and now she wants to testify? I move that she be removed immediately." Judge Rebecca Sartori did not laugh. She removed her glasses with the slow, deliberate patience of a woman who had watched 3 decades of lawyers try to be clever in her presence, cleaned the lenses on her sleeve, and set them back on her nose. Her silver hair was pulled back so tightly, it looked like it had been arranged with an architect's ruler. "Miss Bennett," she said, and the room went quiet. "Do you understand where you are?" Cora nodded, gathering the last of her scattered pages against her chest like a shield. "I do, Your Honor. I understand exactly where I am, and I understand what happens to Mr. Moretti if this seat stays empty." She glanced at the vacant chair beside Lucian, then back at the judge. "Which is why I came." Lucian Moretti had not spoken a word. He sat very still, the way a man sits when he has learned that stillness is its own kind of power, watching this stranger with an expression that gave nothing away. But as Cora stepped past the rail and drew close enough that only he could hear, she leaned toward him and dropped her voice to a whisper. "Mr. Ward told me to come." Something flickered across Lucian's face then, gone almost before it appeared, but Cora saw it. that half second where the mask slipped, and beneath it was pure disbelief. Ward, the lawyer who had vanished without a trace, without a call, without a single reason. This woman had just spoken his name. Crane was on his feet again, red climbing up his neck. Your Honor, I object in the strongest possible terms. We have no idea who this person is. She could be a plant, a distraction, anything. The defense's counsel is absent, and that absence speaks for itself. To allow a housemaid to wander in off the street and derail a case of this magnitude is beyond irregular. It is a mockery of this court. A murmur ran through the gallery, half agreement, half fascination. Cora heard the word housemaid land, and felt it the way she always did, like a small stone dropped into cold water, and for a moment, the old shame rose up in her throat. But she had made a decision somewhere between her cramped apartment and this room, somewhere in the sleepless hours of the night before, and the decision was that she would not be small today. She turned to face the prosecutor fully. The prosecutor is right about one thing, she said, and her voice did not shake. I am a housemaid. I clean Mr. Moretti's floors and I dust his shelves, and I take out his trash. But before that, I was something else. And what I found in that house is not a distraction. It is the truth, and I think a court is supposed to be interested in that. The words hung there. Judge Sartori tilted her head, studying Cora the way one might study a puzzle that had turned out to be far more interesting than expected. A small, unreadable line forming between her brows. The 5 minutes she had granted Lucian Moretti were nearly gone, the sand almost run out, and now here was this trembling, determined woman with grass-stained composure and a leather bag she could barely keep hold of, claiming to hold the thread that could unravel everything. Crane opened his mouth to press again, but the judge raised a single hand, and he fell silent. For a long, suspended moment, the entire courtroom seemed to hold one collective breath, and Cora Bennett stood in the center of it all, alone, waiting to learn whether the most dangerous choice she had ever made would be allowed to matter at all. Crane was not finished, because a man like him did not surrender the floor while there was still an audience to play to, and he turned toward the gallery with the theatrical sweep of someone certain he was about to land a killing blow. Asking the room whether they were truly meant to believe that a woman who scrubbed floors and polished silver had wandered into a federal courtroom with the key to a $600 million conspiracy tucked into her handbag, or whether it was more likely she had simply confused this proceeding with the mop closet down the hall. The gallery laughed again, louder this time, and Crane pressed his advantage, sneering that perhaps the housekeeper would like to dust the judge's bench while she was up here, because that at least was work she was qualified to perform, and Cora felt the heat rush to her face and the old familiar voice rise in the back of her mind, telling her to shrink, to apologize, to make herself small and slip back out the door she had crashed through. For one terrible second she nearly did, her hands trembling around the papers she had gathered, the laughter pressing in on her from every side like water closing over her head, and then she looked at Lucian Moretti, and he was not laughing. He sat perfectly still at the defense table, watching her with those unreadable dark eyes, and there was no mockery in them, and no pity either, only a quiet, waiting attention, as though he alone in that entire room had decided to reserve judgment until she had spoken, and something about that steadiness reached into her and closed a hand around the panic and held it still. Cora drew a breath, straightened her spine, and lifted her chin, and when she spoke her voice no longer wavered, telling the prosecutor that he was right about one thing, that she did clean the Moretti house, that she dusted the shelves and organized the study and carried out the recycling, and that it was precisely because she was invisible to men like him that she had seen what men like him always missed. She told the court that before she ever picked up a mop she had spent years as a certified accountant, that numbers had been her language long before circumstance had put a cleaning cloth in her hand, and that for 8 months she had quietly sorted, filed, and reshelved the financial documents that passed through that household, and that a ledger could not lie to someone who had been trained to hear it speak. Crane's smirk faltered, And Cora went on before he could recover, saying that while everyone in this room had been looking at Lucian Moretti and seeing exactly the villain they wanted to see, she had been looking at the paper trail. And the paper trail told a very different story, one written in dates that did not line up, and figures that had been touched by hands that did not belong to the man on trial. A murmur moved through the gallery, and this time it was not laughter, and Judge Sartori removed her glasses and studied the young woman standing before her, with an expression that had shifted from weary impatience into something sharper and far more curious. She asked Cora directly whether she understood the gravity of what she was claiming, that presenting false evidence to a federal court was itself a crime, and Cora answered that she understood completely, and that she was not asking the court to take her word for anything, only to look at what she had brought, because unlike testimony, documents could be examined, verified, and proven. The prosecutor objected that the woman had no standing, no bar license, no place addressing the court at all, but Sartori raised a single hand that silenced him mid-sentence, and she said that Miss Bennett was not claiming to be counsel, that she had presented herself as a witness in possession of material evidence, and that this court would be failing in its duty if it refused to so much as look at evidence in a case of this magnitude, simply because it arrived in the hands of a housekeeper rather than a lawyer in an expensive suit. She fixed Crane with a look that dared him to argue further, and when he wisely sat down, she turned back to Cora and told her that she would be permitted to present her evidence, that the court would hear her as a witness, and that she had better be prepared to support every word she had just spoken. And Cora, feeling the ground steady beneath her for the first time all morning, answered that she was, "Your Honor," and reached for her briefcase. Judge Sartori declared a 15-minute recess so the court could prepare to receive the evidence, and Cora stepped into the hallway with her legs trembling so badly that she had to lean against the cold stone wall to remain upright, struggling to draw each breath as though someone were charging her for the very air inside the courthouse. She had just faced an entire room that had laughed at her, had just heard her own voice ringing out beneath the weight of all those contemptuous stares, and now, as the adrenaline began to ebb away, all that remained was the shivering exhaustion of someone who'd forced herself to stay strong for far too long. It was then that the phone inside her blazer pocket vibrated, and Cora pulled it out as an icy premonition traveled down her spine, because the screen displayed nothing but an unfamiliar number without a name. The first message contained only 2 words, "Back off," and she stood frozen, staring at it, while telling herself that perhaps it was only some cruel joke sent by a stranger with nothing better to do. Then the phone vibrated again. This time, it was a photograph, and as the image came into focus on the screen, Cora felt as though every drop of blood in her body had turned to ice. It showed the familiar common room of the nursing home in Milwaukee where her mother lived, with the floral upholstered armchair in which she sat by the window every afternoon, her cup of tea resting in the left corner as it had through all those unchanging years, and behind her, blurred through the glass door, stood the shadowy figure of a stranger in the hallway, a shadow that had no reason to be there. Someone had taken that photograph from inside the building. Someone had gone all the way to the place where her mother lived, and that shadow seemed to be silently reminding Cora that they could reach the only woman she had left in this world, whenever they wished. The phone nearly slipped from her violently trembling hand, and Cora had to press her full weight against the wall to keep from collapsing, because she'd tasted this fear before. She already knew what it felt like to stand up and speak the truth, only to pay for it with everything she had, losing her job, her reputation, and even the orderly life she'd worked so hard to build, until nothing remained but her empty hands and a sick mother who depended on her care. She thought of her father, the gentle man who died in an accident at the steel mill when she was still far too young, the man who'd always taught her that numbers never lied, and that a decent human being must never turn away from what was right, and she wondered what he would say to her now if he were still alive, when that very decency was pushing her into the narrow space between safety and danger. Cora hurriedly sent a message to the nursing home to ask about her mother, and every second she spent waiting for an answer stretched into a century, until the screen finally lit up with a message from the nurse on duty, saying that Mrs. Bennet was fine, that she'd just finished her afternoon tea and was sitting by the window listening to the radio. Cora released a breath of relief so deep that she nearly burst into tears. But that relief lasted only a single moment, because the phone vibrated again with a new message from the same unfamiliar number, terrifyingly sweet in its tone, saying how touching it was that she worried so much about her mother, how the elderly woman made her tea at the same time every day, such an endearing habit, and such an easy one to find. Cora felt her knees begin to dissolve beneath her, because they didn't merely know where her mother lived. They knew her daily routine. They even knew that Cora had just sent a message to check on her, which meant they were watching both mother and daughter at the same time. She staggered toward the hallway window and looked down at the parking lot below, and there, in a secluded corner, sat a black Escalade, with windows dark as night, occupying 2 full parking spaces. It was the same vehicle she remembered seeing early that morning when she'd first arrived at the courthouse, and while she was still watching, its headlights flashed once, coldly and slowly, like a warning, or a promise of what was yet to come. When the recess ended and Cora slipped back into the courtroom with the weight of that black Escalade still burning behind her eyes, Prosecutor Crane was already rising to his feet with the relaxed confidence of a man laying down a winning hand, and he announced that the prosecution would call its principal witness, Desmond Hale, former chief financial officer of the Moretti family's holding companies. The man who walked to the stand was everything Cora was not: silver hair combed with surgical precision, a suit that probably cost more than a year of her wages, a watch that caught the courtroom light with every measured movement, and he settled into the witness chair the way a cat settles onto a warm windowsill, utterly certain that the room belonged to him. He took the oath without a flicker of hesitation, and when Crane asked him to describe what he had witnessed during his years overseeing the family's finances, Hale spoke in a voice smooth as polished glass, telling the court that he had personally seen Lucian Moretti instruct employees to move funds through hidden channels, that he had watched the defendant order the alteration of financial records to conceal nearly $600 million in laundered money, and that he had kept documentation of it all out of what he called a sense of civic duty. The word duty made Cora's jaw tighten, because there was something rehearsed in the way he said it, something too clean, as if he had practiced the tremor of conscience in a mirror until it looked real. Crane produced the centerpiece of his case then, a bound ledger that he presented to the court as Exhibit 14, its pages filled with handwritten notes in the margins, figures circled, initials scrawled beside suspicious entries, and he declared with theatrical gravity that these were the personal annotations of the defendant himself, proof written in Lucian Moretti's own hand. A murmur moved through the gallery, and Cora leaned toward Lucian, close enough to whisper, asking him under her breath whether the handwriting was truly his, and Lucian's answer was low and flat and certain, that he had never seen those pages in his life, that whoever wrote them had wanted the court to believe otherwise. Cora studied the man on the stand, and the more she watched him, the colder the feeling in her chest became, because Desmond Hale did not behave like a witness at all. He behaved like a performer who had already read the final page of the script and knew exactly how the story ended. He answered every question a half-second before Crane finished asking it, as though the two of them were dancing to music only they could hear, and each answer landed precisely where the prosecution needed it to land. Never a word too many, never a moment of genuine hesitation, never the small human stumbles that honest memory always leaves behind. Real people, Cora knew from a lifetime of reading ledgers and reading the people who kept them, did not remember dates and figures with such flawless ease. They paused. They corrected themselves. They said, "I think it was around then," but Hale recited everything as if it had been typed into him. She watched his hands, folded too calmly on the rail, and she watched his eyes flick just once toward the gallery, toward a particular row where a distinguished gray-haired figure sat perfectly still, and in that single glance she read something that made her stomach drop, the quiet reassurance of a man checking in with the person who had told him what to say. The jurors, though, were leaning in, nodding, and Cora could feel the case tilting away from Lucian with every polished sentence, could feel the trap tightening in a room that had already decided the powerful man at the defense table was exactly the villain they had come to see. Crane pressed on, asking Hale to confirm the dates on which these instructions had supposedly been given, and Hale gave them without a blink, month by month, meeting by meeting, painting a portrait so detailed and so damning that a woman in the gallery gasped audibly. Lucian remained still beside her, his composure intact, but Cora had spent 8 months in his household and had learned to read the small tells the rest of the world never noticed. The faint tightening at the corner of his jaw, the way his thumb pressed hard against his knuckle beneath the table, and she understood that beneath that mask of calm, he was watching a lie be built brick by brick into a wall meant to bury him alive. And as Hale's voice rolled on, effortless and certain, Cora felt something crystallize inside her, a desperate, dawning conviction that this testimony was not the beginning of the prosecution's story, but the polished ending of a script someone had written long before any of them walked into this room. When Crane finally announced that he'd concluded his examination of the witness and sat down with a look of triumph, Cora's mind was suddenly pulled back to a night less than 2 weeks earlier, the night she'd remained in the study of the Moretti mansion, later than usual, to finish cleaning and reorganizing the piles of papers stacked across the shelves. It had been a cold night, and the entire house had fallen into silence. As she was dusting the row of bookshelves behind the desk, her fingers brushed against something small and hard concealed behind the line of leather-bound spines. When she pulled it out, Cora froze, because the object in her hands was a cat-shaped tin of butterscotch candy, its paint faded with age and one of the cat's ears slightly dented on one side, identical in every detail to the tin her mother had always kept on top of the kitchen cabinet throughout the impoverished years of Cora's childhood in the suburbs. For a moment, the warmth of memory came rushing back and tightened her throat. She remembered the afternoons when her mother would lift the lid and press a piece of butterscotch into her palm whenever she cried. She remembered the familiar clicking sound of the tin lid, and her hand trembled as she opened this container that felt both strange and intimately familiar. But there wasn't a single piece of candy inside. There was only a tiny memory card nestled in the lining, and attached to it was a small handwritten label bearing a single word in careful script: truth. Cora had taken the memory card back to her small apartment that night, inserted it into her aging computer, and tried to open it, but all the data inside had been encrypted behind layers of security she couldn't possibly break through. Because she'd assumed it was probably nothing more than a misplaced work file, she'd slipped it into a drawer and nearly forgotten about it amid the relentless cycle of her working shifts. It wasn't until that morning, when Elias Ward vanished without a word of explanation, and a mysterious caller phoned at 5 o'clock to tell her that she would know what to do, that the card inside the candy tin was the key, while reading out a string of passcodes to decrypt the data, that all the scattered pieces in her mind suddenly locked into place. She realized then that what she'd accidentally discovered wasn't a misplaced document, but a bomb someone had deliberately left behind, waiting for someone courageous enough to light the fuse. Back in the present courtroom, Cora rose to her feet, her heart pounding, and asked for permission to present new evidence to the court. Crane immediately sprang up and objected that evidence never previously disclosed couldn't be admitted, but Judge Sartori raised a hand to silence him and asked Cora what kind of evidence it was and where she'd found it. Cora drew a deep breath and replied that it was a digital data storage device, concealed inside the Moretti mansion. When the judge pressed her to explain exactly where it had been hidden, Cora hesitated for a moment, then answered in the firmest voice she could summon, saying that it had been hidden inside a cat-shaped candy tin placed behind the books on a shelf. The entire room fell silent for a single beat. Then, someone in the spectators' gallery let out a laugh, followed by a second and then a third, until the courtroom trembled with waves of stifled laughter. Even Judge Sartori had to remove her glasses and polish them slowly to conceal the twitching corners of her mouth. "A cat-shaped candy tin," she repeated skeptically. And Crane seized the opportunity to declare that this was the most ridiculous thing he'd ever witnessed in his career, asking whether federal justice was now to be decided by a child's toy meant to hold candy. But Cora didn't waver. She allowed the laughter to fade, then said in a voice of surprising calm that it was precisely where someone would hide something they didn't want discovered, because who in the world would search for evidence in a case worth $600 million inside a cat-shaped butterscotch tin hidden behind a row of books? By the time she'd finished speaking, the laughter in the courtroom had vanished completely, replaced by a curious silence, drawn as tight as a bowstring. After a period of deliberation, Judge Sartori announced that the court would provisionally admit the evidence so its authenticity could be examined, and she ordered the court's technical staff to insert the memory card into the computer system connected to the large screens mounted throughout the courtroom. Cora took a deep breath, reading out the string of passcodes she had received at dawn for the technician to enter, while she stood motionless, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles turned white, praying that what Ward had left behind truly was the key he'd promised it would be. The screens came to life, and the first files appeared, countless financial records, endless columns of numbers, balance sheets arranged in meticulous order, and amid that vast sea of data, Cora's eyes, sharpened by years of accounting work, immediately locked onto exactly what she needed to find. She stepped toward the screen and began to speak, her voice growing steadier as she explained to the court that the ledger pages the prosecutor had just presented as evidence against her client, the pages bearing what was claimed to be Mr. Moretti's handwriting, had in fact been altered. She asked everyone to pay close attention to the hidden information attached to each file, what professionals called metadata, which preserved a trace of every occasion on which a document had been created or modified. Cora pointed to the timeline displayed on the screen and said that, according to the prosecution's allegations, Mr. Moretti had ordered the books to be manipulated in March of the previous year. Yet the metadata from those very documents showed that they had last been altered in June, 3 months after all the alleged criminal acts were supposed to have occurred, a fact that couldn't possibly be explained if those pages were truly the originals. A murmur rose throughout the courtroom, but Cora didn't give it time to subside. She pointed to another line of data, the one identifying the address of the device used to make the alterations, and declared that the modification command hadn't originated from any computer within the Moretti family's system. It had come from a computer registered to Kessler Group, a name that seemed to make the entire courtroom hold its breath for a moment. Then she turned sharply toward Desmond Hale, who was still seated in the witness chair, and for the first time since he'd entered the courtroom, the polished confidence surrounding the man began to fracture. "Mr. Hale," Cora said, her voice now completely free of its earlier trembling, "you testified under oath that you personally witnessed my client order these ledgers to be altered in March. How, then, do you explain the fact that those same documents bear evidence of being modified in June, 3 months after you'd already left the company?" Hale opened his mouth, hesitated, then stammered that there must have been some kind of technical error. But Cora didn't let him escape. She asked how a man who'd once served as chief financial officer of an entire financial technology corporation could fail to understand the most basic principles of metadata, and how he could explain why the modification command had been issued from a computer belonging to Kessler Group rather than the Moretti family. Beads of sweat began to gather across Hale's forehead, drops that everyone in the courtroom could see beneath the lights, and he looked toward Crane for help. But the prosecutor was now hunched over his files, frantically turning through page after page, while pretending that everything remained under control. Cora could feel the current in the room beginning to shift. She could see that the jurors were no longer looking at Lucian as though he were a condemned criminal. Instead, their attention was turning toward the sweating man in the witness chair, their eyes filling with suspicion. And in that moment, for the first time since she'd stumbled through the courtroom doors with papers flying in every direction, Cora Bennett felt the scales of justice beginning to tilt. Only slightly, but enough for her to know that the door leading to the truth had just begun to open. At the very moment Hale was stammering in search of a way to pull himself free from the quagmire of metadata, the courtroom doors burst open once again with a resounding crash, and a young man staggered into the center aisle, looking as though he'd just run across half the city. His hair stood on end, his glasses tilted to one side, his shirt had come untucked from his waistband, and he was carrying a stack of reports so high that he could barely see where he was going. "Wait," he cried breathlessly. "I found more." Court security immediately rushed forward to stop him, but the young man dodged them with an agility that seemed astonishing for someone so awkward in appearance. Then, in the very next second, his untied shoelace decided that this was its moment to shine, and he tripped and sprawled across the floor. The stack of reports in his arms exploded into the air like a display of paper fireworks, sending pages scattering throughout the courtroom. They landed across the benches, drifted onto the floor, and one sheet descended gracefully onto Judge Sartori's silver hair. The entire room fell silent for a beat. The judge slowly lifted the page from her head with the expression of someone choosing her words very carefully, then asked who he was. The young man scrambled to his feet, adjusted the glasses that were now sitting completely sideways across his face, and answered that his name was Milo Fenn, that he was a financial analyst for the Moretti Group, and that he apologized for his entrance. He'd just run 12 city blocks, and physical fitness clearly wasn't one of his strengths. Cora hurried forward to intervene. "Your Honor, Mr. Fenn is a member of the analytical team that examined the data from the memory card." Judge Sartori sighed and asked what he'd found that was important enough to turn her courtroom into a paper storm. Milo finally located the page he needed. It was crumpled, but still legible, and he held it aloft in triumph as he explained that he'd traced the entire flow of money, that $47 million had been transferred into an account in the Cayman Islands through 12 separate transactions over the course of 6 months. When Cora asked where the funds had originated, Milo smiled and replied that they'd come from a corporate account belonging to Kessler Group, passed through a shell company called Pinnacle Trust, a company with no registered employees, no physical office, and which had been established exactly 3 days before the first transfer. "But the most remarkable part," Milo continued, his voice growing more confident with every word, "is that the person listed as director of that phantom company is Adrian Kessler's brother-in-law, and there's more." When I compared the date of each transaction with Mr. Moretti's internal schedule, I discovered that every transfer was made on a day when the client was out of town, attending a conference or meeting with business partners. That means someone deliberately waited until he left Chicago to conduct the transactions and then frame him for them, someone on the inside who knew his every movement. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and Cora turned toward Hale and asked him directly whether he knew anything about those transfers. The man who'd once appeared so polished and confident had now gone pale. He pressed his lips together and remained silent for a long moment. Then, finally, in the voice of someone who knew he'd lost, he announced that he was invoking his rights under the Fifth Amendment and refused to answer on the grounds that he might incriminate himself. The spectators' gallery exploded, because the prosecution's star witness had just formally protected himself from criminal prosecution while still sitting in the witness chair. Crane leaped to his feet in desperation, shouting that Ms. Bennett was turning the courtroom into a television show. Cora turned toward him with a sparkle in her eyes and replied in a voice as sweet as sugar that the prosecutor might want to take a deep breath, because the vein in his forehead was throbbing even harder than her overdue rent. The entire courtroom burst into laughter, but this time they were laughing at Crane, whose face had turned so violently red that he looked ready to start smoking. Judge Sartori brought down her gavel and declared a 1-hour recess so the prosecution could reconsider its position, and the first thing Cora did when she stepped into the hallway wasn't celebrate the victory she'd just won. Instead, she pulled out her phone and immediately called the nursing home in Milwaukee, because the image of that stranger's shadow behind the window of her mother's room had been smoldering in her mind throughout the entire morning. The phone rang twice before her mother answered, and her voice came through sounding both familiar and strangely distant, hesitant and confused in the way Alzheimer's disease had gradually stolen her memories from her, one small piece at a time. "Cora, it's unusual for you to call at this hour," her mother said. "You're still at school, aren't you? What time will you be home for dinner?" The question seemed to close a hand around Cora's heart and squeeze, because her mother had once again mistaken her for the child she'd been decades before, back when she still carried her books to school and her father was still alive. "Mom," Cora said, struggling to keep her voice calm even as her throat tightened. "I need you to listen to me and do exactly what I tell you. Don't ask any questions, all right? I need you to pack a small bag. In a little while, some kind nurses will come and take you somewhere safer for a few days." The elderly woman on the other end of the line fell silent for a moment, then asked in a trembling voice whether Cora was in some kind of danger. In that brief instant, clarity seemed to return to her, a mother's instinct rising above even the illness, and Cora had to bite down hard on her lip to keep from crying. "Nothing's wrong, Mom," she lied. "I just want you to have a little change of scenery. Please trust me." Her mother answered with the same words Cora remembered from childhood, the words she'd always used whenever life became difficult, and there was no room left for weakness. "All right, I trust you. And remember to take care of yourself." Cora ended the call with her eyes blurred by tears, then immediately contacted the nursing home's administrators and arranged for her mother to be transferred to another facility under an assumed name, instructing them not to reveal the new location to anyone under any circumstances. Once that was done, Cora turned to find Milo Fenn, who was still struggling to gather his crumpled reports in a corner of the hallway, and asked whether he knew how to draft a sworn statement, a properly formatted affidavit. Milo blinked and said that he knew the required format, though it wasn't exactly his area of expertise. Cora waved away his concern and told him that was more than enough, because she needed him to help her prepare one immediately. For the next 20 minutes, standing in the cold hallway of the courthouse, Cora dictated every word while Milo typed. She recorded everything: the threatening messages from the unidentified number, the photograph of her mother taken from inside her room at the nursing home, the black Escalade that had been waiting in the parking lot since before dawn, and the exact time at which every threat had been sent. When they finished, she signed her name, Milo signed beneath it as a witness, and then she photographed each page with her phone. "Now," Cora said, her voice once again hard with resolve, "I need you to send this to 3 different addresses." She dictated the address of her personal email account, the address of a former law professor whom she trusted completely, and after a moment's hesitation, the address of the legal department within this very federal courthouse in Chicago. "If anything happens to me," she told Milo, her voice so calm that it sent a shiver through the young man, "at least this affidavit will ensure that the threats have been documented, and whoever is behind all of this won't be able to pretend they had nothing to do with it." Milo looked at her with a mixture of admiration and fear, and asked whether she truly believed they would dare to act against her. Cora quietly replied that powerful people were always willing to do terrible things to protect their secrets, and she'd rather be prepared in advance. Cora had barely slipped her phone back into her pocket when the air inside the courthouse lobby seemed to turn colder, and she looked up just in time to see the great doors swing open, allowing a man to enter as though the entire world had always belonged to him. Adrian Kessler was in his 50s, his graying hair swept back with precision down to the last strand, and the suit he wore probably cost more than Cora's aging car. He carried himself like a man who'd never heard the word no in his life, or who'd destroyed anyone foolish enough to say it. His gaze swept across the lobby until it found Cora, and then he smiled. But it wasn't an ordinary smile. It was the smile of a predator just before it struck, cold and calculating, promising things Cora didn't want to imagine. The people around them instinctively moved aside, creating an invisible corridor between him and her. Even the reporters kept their distance. Kessler walked directly toward her, each footstep echoing across the marble floor, until he stopped less than a meter away. "So you're the young woman playing lawyer," he said, his voice as smooth as silk wrapped around steel. Cora raised her chin and replied that she was actually a witness, and there was no small difference between the two. Kessler tilted his head and studied her as though she were some peculiar insect, then asked whether she knew who he was. Cora calmly answered that of course she did. "Adrian Kessler, founder of Kessler Group, former partner of my client, and apparently the man whose money transfers are creating quite a great deal of confusion inside this courthouse." Something flashed in his eyes, something dangerous, and he lowered his voice to a whisper meant for her ears alone. He told her that she was inviting disaster upon herself, that people far more powerful than she could ever hope to be had tried to stand against him before, and asked whether she knew where they were now. Cora held his gaze without wavering, and Kessler answered his own question. "They disappeared, just like your lawyer friend Elias Ward, just like anyone who dares stand in my way." The words fell into place inside Cora's mind like the final piece of a puzzle, because he'd just inadvertently confirmed what she'd suspected since that morning. Ward hadn't chosen to run away. He'd been removed, forced into silence before he could finish his work. "Are you threatening me?" Cora asked, deliberately raising her voice just enough for the people nearby to hear. Kessler merely gave a faint laugh and replied that he was warning her, and there was a difference between the two. "How interesting," Cora said, folding her arms across her chest, "because in the last 40 minutes, I've received anonymous threats along with a photograph of my mother taken from inside her room at the nursing home. I've documented everything, signed an affidavit, and sent copies to 3 different addresses, including the legal department of this very courthouse." The smile on Kessler's face froze, and Cora stepped closer, narrowing the distance between them. "So if anything happens to me, or to my mother, or to anyone I know, there'll be a very clear trail leading directly back to you." Then she tilted her head and, with deliberately innocent curiosity, asked whether the expensive cologne he was wearing truly smelled that good, or whether it was simply the scent of guilt. The silence that followed lasted for a single beat. Then someone behind Kessler laughed, followed by a second person, and then a third, until the small crowd that had gathered around them was laughing at Adrian Kessler. His expression changed, and the predator's smile vanished completely, replaced by a cold fury, a hatred so pure and concentrated that Cora could almost feel the chill radiating from it. But this time, she didn't take a single step back. When the trial resumed, Crane rose to his feet, looking like a man trying to save a ship that had already begun to sink. Yet the last faint trace of confidence still lingered in his voice as he announced that the prosecution wished to present a new exhibit, surveillance footage obtained from the Silver Peak Hotel, proving the defendant's presence at an illegal meeting with foreign investors. Cora felt Lucian tense slightly beside her, and he leaned closer to whisper that the meeting had never happened. She quietly replied that she knew and told him to let her handle it. The courtroom lights dimmed as the large screen came to life, revealing grainy images of a hotel lobby with white marble, enormous crystal chandeliers, and people hurrying back and forth. Then there he was. Lucian Moretti entered the hotel, shook hands with a group of men in suits, and walked toward the elevators, while a timestamp flashed in the corner of the screen, showing the night of March 15th, at 9:47 in the evening. "As you can see," Crane narrated triumphantly, "the defendant was present at the Silver Peak Hotel on the night of March 15th to meet with representatives of shell companies and discuss the illegal transfer of funds." A murmur spread through the spectators' gallery, and Cora frowned as she studied the footage closely. She could sense that something was wrong, even if she couldn't yet identify precisely what it was, until her eyes, trained to detect the smallest detail, came to rest on a shadowed corner of the image. At the back of the lobby, partly concealed behind a decorative column, hung an antique wall clock, the kind luxurious hotels loved to display, and the time shown on its face didn't match the timestamp on the video at all. Cora sprang to her feet. "Your Honor, The witness requests that the video be paused. Crane immediately spun around and objected that she had no right to interrupt the presentation of an exhibit, but Cora cut him off. "I do, if there's an irregularity in that exhibit." And there is. Judge Sartori raised a hand and asked her to explain. Cora walked toward the screen, her heart pounding but her voice steady, and pointed to the left corner of the image. "If the court will look at the wall clock partly visible behind that column, the video's timestamp says 9:47 in the evening, but the clock on the wall clearly reads 6:20, a difference of more than 3 hours. That could only happen if the timestamp on the footage had been altered." The entire courtroom fell silent as every eye turned toward the screen. Crane stammered that the wall clock could simply have been wrong, but Cora wasn't finished. She pointed to the image of Lucian entering the hotel and said there was another problem. "In this footage, my client is wearing a navy blue suit." Then she turned toward Lucian and asked whether he could tell the court where he'd been on the night of March 15th. Lucian rose and replied that he'd been in San Francisco attending an annual technology conference. There were hundreds of photographs and recordings documenting his presence there throughout the entire day and evening. When Cora asked what he'd worn to the event, he almost smiled as he answered that he'd been wearing a gray suit and had photographs of himself in that clothing. Cora turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, the witness can prove that Mr. Moretti was in San Francisco on the night of March 15th, wearing a suit entirely different from the one shown in this footage. That means either my client can be in 2 places at once, or this exhibit was staged." A quiet laugh rose from the spectators' gallery, and Cora delivered her final blow by asking the court to order verification of the video's source. Under pressure, Crane was forced to admit that the footage had been provided by Kessler Group through what he called its private investigative channels, causing the blood in Cora's body to freeze and then immediately begin to boil. Judge Sartori leaned forward and declared that the exhibit would be deemed invalid until the original data had been fully authenticated. Then she turned toward Crane, her voice as cold as steel, and warned him to examine every piece of evidence supplied by Kessler Group with the greatest possible care, because her court wouldn't tolerate the fabrication of evidence. All through the spectators' gallery, whispers began asking the same question. Who was that young woman? The judge declared the trial recessed for the second time that day, and Cora needed air, needed a moment of quiet, far from the suffocating courtroom where every gaze seemed to carry the weight of an entire family. She stepped out through the side door, the very door she'd stumbled through that morning, a morning that now felt as though it had taken place a century ago. The Chicago afternoon air was bitterly cold, the chill biting into her skin and awakening every sense, and Cora closed her eyes for a moment, allowing the wind to slip through her thin blazer. "You're going to freeze to death out here." Lucian's voice made her open her eyes. He stood a few steps away, with his hands in his pockets, his suit still immaculate despite everything that had happened. Cora quietly replied that she could handle it, that she'd grown up in the cold, and that this was only a spring breeze. Lucian smiled and walked closer, stopping beside her, and for a while, the two of them simply stood in silence, gazing across the nearly empty parking lot and breathing in the frigid air. At last, he quietly asked how she was feeling. Cora said she was doing reasonably well, then let out a humorless laugh and told him that she'd started the morning as a maid who didn't even know where the mop was kept, and now she had a powerful man who hated her, a prosecutor who wanted her head, and a mother hiding somewhere for her own safety, so all things considered, she was doing reasonably well. Lucian remained silent for a moment, then asked whether her mother was safe. Cora replied that she hoped so, her voice growing subdued. Her mother didn't even truly understand what was happening, and Cora didn't want her to be any more frightened than necessary. "You did the right thing," Lucian said softly. Then he looked at her, in a way that caused something strange to stir inside her chest. But at that very moment, something in the far corner of the parking lot caught Cora's eye. It was the black Escalade, the same vehicle that had been parked there since morning, the same one whose headlights had flashed like a warning, and it was moving. "Lucian," she gasped, the color draining from her voice. He'd barely had time to ask what was wrong when the SUV's engine roared and the vehicle came hurtling directly toward them. For 1 second, a single second that seemed to last an entire hour, Cora stood rooted to the spot. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to obey. Lucian was the one who reacted. He wrapped an arm around her waist and yanked her violently to one side with a strength she hadn't expected. They fell together onto the grass beside the road and rolled away from the pavement at the exact moment the vehicle thundered past, missing the place where they'd been standing by mere inches. Brakes shrieked, and the Escalade swerved before regaining control and speeding toward the parking lot exit. Within seconds, it had vanished into the traffic on the main road, leaving behind a silence so thick it seemed almost solid. Cora lay on the grass, her heart pounding so violently that she could hear it beating inside her temples. Part of Lucian's weight still rested against her, his arm remained wrapped around her waist, and he lifted his head, his face only inches from hers, and asked whether she was hurt. Then, strangely, Cora began to laugh. It was a nearly hysterical laugh, the kind that escaped when the body didn't know whether it should cry or scream. She told him to look at them, 2 grown adults rolling around on the grass outside a courthouse as though they were acting in some third-rate action movie, and Lucian began laughing with her. But then her laughter died away, because she suddenly understood something. This was no longer a warning. It was a genuine attempt to harm her. Fear for her mother surged back into her throat and nearly choked her, and Lucian reached out and lifted her chin, his gaze as steady as steel. "No one will touch your mother," he said. "I promise you, and I'll prove it." After what happened in the parking lot, Lucian refused to allow Cora to return to her small, unguarded apartment, and despite her feeble protests that it wouldn't be proper, he replied simply that his estate had a security team on duty at all times, cameras covering every square inch of the grounds, and that it was currently the safest place in Chicago. The armored car carried them away from the city, following the winding lakeside roads through the outskirts, until the urban lights receded behind them like distant stars. The estate that appeared before Cora wasn't the ostentatious palace of gold she'd imagined a mafia boss would own, but a structure of glass and natural stone nestled among thick groves of trees beside the tranquil lake, warm and peaceful. The moment she stepped inside, she was enveloped by the warmth radiating from a crackling fireplace. Lucian removed his coat and asked whether she was hungry, and Cora's stomach betrayed her with a growl that echoed through the silence, making him laugh. He led her into a kitchen as large as her entire apartment and told her to sit on one of the high stools beside the island while he prepared something to eat. Cora stared at him in surprise and asked whether he knew how to cook. As Lucian opened the refrigerator and took out pasta, tomatoes, basil, and olive oil, he replied that he hadn't always been a powerful man. He'd grown up in a cramped 2-room apartment on the south side, where his mother worked 2 shifts every day to support her children, and he'd learned to cook when he was 10 because someone had to make dinner while she was still out earning a living. Cora quietly watched him slice tomatoes with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it countless times before, and she told him that he'd never shared any of this in his interviews. Lucian replied that it was no one's business. People only wanted to hear about innovation, the empire, and the future. No one wanted to know about the little boy who'd once stood at the stove cooking pasta for his exhausted mother. He fell silent for a moment, then quietly added that he'd once had a younger brother. His voice grew subdued as he explained that his brother had died while still very young, during the years when gang violence ravaged that impoverished neighborhood. The loss had haunted Lucian throughout his life, shaping him into the man he'd become, while leaving him with a single desire: to bring everything his family had built out of the shadows and transform it into something legitimate and clean, so that no other child would ever have to die because of such things. Cora felt something tighten inside her chest, and when Lucian placed a steaming plate of pasta with tomato sauce before her, she began to speak. She didn't know why. Perhaps it was because, for the first time in a very long while, someone was genuinely listening. She told him that the most painful part hadn't been losing her job, but the feeling that the entire world had turned its back on her, simply because she'd dared to tell the truth. Colleagues who'd once been close to her suddenly looked at her as though she were a traitor. Doors slammed shut one after another. Worst of all, after enough lonely nights, she'd begun to wonder whether she'd truly been right, whether perhaps she was the one who'd been insane all along. That kind of self-doubt, she said, her voice trembling, devours a person even more cruelly than poverty, because at least when you're poor, you can still believe in yourself. Lucian looked at her for a long moment, then told her that she wasn't insane, and that she'd never been wrong. But in that warm and intimate moment, it was Lucian who brought them both back to reality. He quietly reminded her that Judge Sartori would deliver her ruling the following morning, that although they'd won each small battle that day, Adrian Kessler was still out there, free and filled with hatred, and the real battle would still be waiting for them when dawn arrived. They had carried their plates out to the enclosed porch that looked over the dark, quiet waters of the lake, and for a while, they ate in a comfortable silence that neither of them felt any need to fill. When Cora's phone buzzed against the table, and her heart lurched by pure instinct. But this time, the screen did not show an unknown number. It showed the name of the care facility, where her mother now lived, and she answered with her breath held tight in her chest. Her mother's voice came through, soft and a little confused in that way the illness had made familiar, telling her that 2 men in suits had arrived at the new facility, that they said they were security guards hired by someone named Lucian Moretti, that they had promised to watch over the building through the night, and asking her daughter whether this was true, because she felt a little worried. Cora slowly lowered the phone and turned to look at Lucian, her eyes wide, asking him in barely more than a whisper whether he had sent guards to protect her mother, and he did not look away as he answered that he had called his people the moment she had stepped away to the restroom back at the courthouse, that they had reached her mother hours ago and would not leave her side. For a long moment, Cora simply stared at him, because she had said she would protect her mother, and he had quietly made it so, had done the thing rather than merely promising it, and something inside her that had been clenched tight for years, for as long as she could remember, finally began to loosen. She lifted the phone back to her ear and told her mother in the steadiest voice she could manage that yes, it was true, that the men were good people sent to keep her safe, that she should trust them and rest, that she loved her more than anything and would explain everything soon, and her mother answered with a sentence that broke something open in Cora's chest, that if this man was taking such care of her daughter, then he must be a good man, and that she felt so much better knowing her little girl was not alone. When the call ended, a tear slipped down Cora's face before she could stop it, and Lucian rose from his chair and came around the table to kneel beside her, asking gently whether everything was all right, and Cora wiped at her cheek and laughed at herself, saying that it had simply been a very long time since anyone had taken care of her, that she had always been the one holding everything together for everyone else, even while she was quietly falling apart inside, and that she did not know how to be the person someone else protected. Lucian took her hand and told her that she had better get used to it, because he had no intention of stopping, and then he gently drew her to her feet, so that they stood close together on the porch beneath a sky scattered with more stars than she had seen in years, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him in the cold lakeside air. He brought his hand to her face, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that made her tremble, and he told her that since the moment she had asked Adrian Kessler whether his cologne smelled of guilt, he had not been able to stop thinking about her, and Cora knew there were 1,000 reasons this was a terrible idea, that it was too soon, that he was the man whose case she had walked into only that morning, but instead of saying any of them, she leaned forward and kissed him. The kiss began soft and hesitant, almost a question, but when she wrapped her arms around his neck, he pulled her closer, one hand at the small of her back, and the other still cradling her face, and for one weightless moment, the courtroom and the black SUV, and the man who wanted them both destroyed, all fell away into nothing. When they finally drew apart, her forehead resting against his and both of them breathless, Lucian murmured that she was exhausted and needed to sleep, that there was a room already prepared for her upstairs, and as he walked her toward the staircase he paused and said the words quietly, almost like a warning to them both, that dawn was coming, and with it the final battle that would decide everything. When Cora woke, the morning light was already spilling through the curtains, and for one disoriented moment she could not remember where she was, until the memories of the day before came rushing back like a tide: the courtroom, the evidence on the screens, the black SUV, the kiss beneath the stars, and she sat up in a bed larger than her entire apartment, feeling strangely rested for a woman walking into the fight of her life. Hanging on the closet door, she found a neatly pressed charcoal blazer and a crisp white blouse, clearly chosen with care, and pinned to the hanger was a small handwritten note in a firm, unhurried script, telling her that he had guessed she would need something for today, that he hoped it fit, and that breakfast would be waiting when she came down. Cora smiled despite everything, murmuring under her breath that the man was impossible, and 15 minutes later, dressed and looking more put together than she had in days, she made her way downstairs to find Lucian in the kitchen with his back to her, moving something in a pan, while the smell of fresh coffee and warm bread filled the air. He turned when he heard her, and the smile that lit his face made something in her chest lift, and he asked whether the blazer had fit, to which she replied that it fit perfectly, then teased that she wondered whether he kept a supply of women's blazers on hand for all the witnesses who spent the night. Lucian laughed and set a plate in front of her, eggs and fruit and toast arranged with the same quiet competence he brought to everything, telling her that he had simply asked one of his people to have it delivered before dawn, one of the small mercies of having a team awake at all hours, and Cora sat at the counter and ate, while the two of them stole glances at each other across the marble, like a pair of people who had crossed a line the night before, and were not the least bit sorry for it. Neither of them spoke of the kiss directly, because they did not need to. It hung in the air between them warm and certain, and yet beneath the lightness, there was a current of steel running through them both, an awareness that in less than an hour, Judge Sartori would deliver the ruling that decided whether Lucian walked out of that courthouse a free man or lost everything he had spent his life building. Cora finally set down her fork and looked at him, asking quietly whether he was ready, and Lucian held her gaze for a long moment before answering that he had faced hostile investors and treacherous rivals and worse, but that he had never once walked into a room feeling the way he felt now, and when she asked what way that was, he said simply that, for the first time in years, he was not walking in alone. The words settled over her like a hand pressed gently to the chest, and Cora rose from the stool, smoothing down the blazer he had chosen for her, and said that then they had better not keep the judge waiting. Outside, the armored car was already idling in the drive, one of the guards holding the door open, and as they stepped into the cold, bright morning, Lucian reached over and took her hand, and this time when their fingers laced together neither of them let go. Two people who had started the previous day as a client, and the housekeeper nobody noticed. Now riding side by side toward the courtroom where the truth she had risked her life to carry would finally be weighed, and whatever waited for them behind those heavy doors, Cora Bennett knew with a certainty that startled her that she would rather face it beside this man than run from it alone. The federal courtroom seemed different that morning, or perhaps it was Cora who was different, because she walked through the same door she had stumbled through a day earlier, but this time her steps were steady, and the borrowed blazer sat square on her shoulders like armor, and the gallery was even more crowded than before, reporters filling every available seat, cameras angled from every permitted corner, the air itself vibrating with an almost unbearable expectation. She spotted Kessler seated in the first row, another flawless suit, but there was a stiffness in his posture that had not been there the day before, a tension in his shoulders that spoke of a sleepless night, and Cora thought quietly to herself that he had earned every minute of it. Judge Rebecca Sartori entered precisely on the hour, and the entire room rose and settled in a single rehearsed motion, and she announced that after a thorough review of the documentary evidence, the witness testimony, and the forensic analysis of the materials introduced over the course of the proceedings, She was prepared to deliver her ruling. The silence that followed was absolute, and Cora felt Lucian go still beside her, his hand finding hers beneath the table and pressing once, briefly, before she made herself let go so that no one would see. Sartori put on her glasses and opened the folder before her, and she stated that in the matter of the government against Lucian Moretti, given the demonstrated tampering with the prosecution's central exhibits, the discredited testimony of its principal witness, and the grave questions surrounding the origin of evidence, supplied by a third party, this court found that the case as presented could not stand, and she ordered that all charges against the defendant be suspended, effective immediately, pending further investigation. The gallery erupted, and Cora felt the air leave her lungs in a single trembling rush. But the judge was not finished, and she raised her voice above the noise to say that based on the evidence the defense had brought before this court, she was forwarding a formal recommendation to the federal prosecutor's office to open a full investigation into Kessler Group, its principals, and its affiliates for suspected fabrication of evidence, embezzlement of funds through fraudulent shell entities, and obstruction of justice. At those words, Adrian Kessler shot to his feet in the front row, his composure finally shattering, his face flushing a deep and dangerous red as he demanded to be heard, protesting that this was a farce, that a housekeeper and a stack of forged documents had turned a court of law into a circus. Judge Sartori did not so much as blink, and she told him in a voice cold and flat as a blade to sit down, that he was not a party to these proceedings, and had no standing to address her courtroom, and when he continued to speak, insisting that he would not sit while his name was dragged through the mud, she struck her gavel 3 times in rapid succession and warned that if he did not seat himself immediately, she would have the marshals remove him. Kessler looked around the room, saw the bailiff already taking a step toward him, saw the reporters scribbling furiously and the cameras trained on his fury, and he lowered himself slowly back into his seat, his jaw locked so tight that Cora could see the muscle jumping beneath the skin, and for the first time since he had swept into that building as though he owned it, Adrian Kessler looked like a man watching the ground open beneath his feet. The judge then turned her attention to Cora, and she said that this court recognized the extraordinary work of the defense's witness, under circumstances no one in the room could have anticipated, that her dedication to the truth in the face of clear personal danger was noted for the record, and would not be forgotten. And Cora rose on legs that suddenly felt unsteady and managed only a quiet "Thank you, Your Honor," before sinking back into her chair, as the weight of a day and a night and a lifetime of holding herself together finally, mercifully, began to lift from her shoulders, and beside her, Lucian let out a slow breath of his own, though his eyes, she noticed, never once left the man seething in the front row. Before Judge Sartori could bring the gavel down to adjourn the session, the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom swung open once more, and this time it was not a stumbling stranger who entered, but 3 federal agents moving with the unhurried certainty of people who knew exactly why they were there. The tallest of them stepping into the center aisle and offering an apology to the court for the interruption before introducing himself as Agent Morrison of the Bureau and stating that they carried information directly relevant to these proceedings. The judge frowned and told him to proceed, and Morrison explained that roughly 2 hours earlier, 2 individuals had been apprehended in Wisconsin while attempting to force their way into a care facility outside the city, a residence that had recently taken in a new patient under a protected name, and Cora felt her blood turn to ice in her veins because she knew before he said another word exactly which facility he meant, exactly which patient. The individuals, Morrison continued, had been intercepted and detained by a private security team stationed at the property, and upon questioning both, had confessed that they were hired to intimidate the family of a witness in this very case, as a means of pressuring her to abandon her testimony, and then the agent turned slowly and looked directly at the man seated rigid in the front row, and said that both men had named the person who hired them, Adrian Kessler. The courtroom detonated into chaos, reporters surging to their feet, cameras flashing in a frantic storm of light, and Kessler rose from his seat, with his face drained of all its color, shouting that it was a lie, that he had never met those men, that this was a coordinated frame orchestrated by the Moretti family. But Agent Morrison was already walking toward him with a second agent flanking wide, and he informed Kessler in a level, carrying voice that he was under arrest for conspiracy to intimidate a witness, for obstruction of justice, and for fraud, and that he had the right to remain silent. Cora watched almost as though the world had slowed to half its speed as the agents drew Kessler's hands behind his back and the cuffs closed around the wrists of the man who had sent that photograph of her mother's window, who had ordered the black SUV that had nearly ended them both, who had made Elias Ward vanish, and for one suspended moment the polished, untouchable predator who had strolled into this building as though the law itself bent around him, simply ceased to exist, replaced by a man thrashing against his restraints and hurling threats that landed on no one. He twisted toward the defense table as they turned him toward the aisle, and his eyes found Cora's, blazing with a hatred so pure it might have frightened her a day ago, and he snarled that she had no idea what she had just done, that people like her did not get to win, but Cora only held his gaze, and did not look away, and did not tremble, because she had spent one lifetime being made to feel small for telling the truth, and she was finished shrinking. The agents escorted him down the center aisle, past the rows of stunned faces and the wall of cameras that captured every second of his undoing, his shouts growing hoarser and more desperate with each step, until the doors closed behind him and cut them off entirely, leaving in their wake a silence that felt almost holy. Cora let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 2 days, and beside her, Lucian reached over and covered her hand with his. And when she finally turned to look at him, she found him watching her, not with the guarded calculation of the man she had met the morning before, but with something open and unguarded and warm, and he said quietly that her mother was safe, that it was truly over now, and Cora nodded, though her eyes were burning, because she was thinking of a gray-haired woman in a floral chair who made tea at the same hour every morning, and who would never know how close the darkness had come, nor how fiercely her daughter had stood between it and her, and in that moment, surrounded by the fading roar of a courtroom that had watched a giant fall, Cora Bennett finally allowed herself to believe that she had won. The Moretti building had never seemed so tall as it did that afternoon, and when the elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, Cora held her breath, because there, seated in one of the lobby armchairs and looking older, and more worn than she remembered anyone describing him, was Elias Ward, alive, his suit rumpled and his jaw shadowed with unshaven stubble, and dark circles beneath his eyes, but unmistakably, impossibly alive. He rose slowly when he saw her, and before she could decide whether she wanted to embrace him or shout at him, he said quietly that she had been even better than he had imagined, and Cora asked the only question that would come: where had he been? Why had he vanished and left them all standing in that courtroom with nothing? Ward lowered himself back into the chair, as though the weight of the world sat on his shoulders, and told her that 3 weeks earlier, a package had arrived at his home, photographs of his daughter and his grandchildren going about their ordinary lives, a message beneath them, telling him to disappear, or they would, and that Kessler had people everywhere, in offices and agencies and places he could not name, so that he had not known who he could trust, which was precisely why he had chosen someone from outside the system entirely, someone with no connections that could be bought or bent. And when Cora asked why her, of all people, a housekeeper he had barely exchanged 2 words with, Ward gave a tired smile and said that he had been watching her far longer than she knew, that he had noticed the way she quietly reorganized the household ledgers, the small pencil marks she left in the margins beside figures that did not add up, corrections no ordinary housekeeper would ever catch, and that he had looked into her past and learned that she had once been an accountant who stood up and told the truth about a fraud and had lost everything she owned for it. That, he said, was the thing he could not buy in any lawyer at any price, a person whose integrity had already survived the fire, someone who had paid the full cost of doing the right thing, and had chosen to keep doing it anyway. Cora felt her throat tighten, and then she asked the question that had haunted her since that late night in the study, the tin candy box shaped like a cat. And Ward's smile deepened with something like affection as he admitted that nothing about it had been an accident, that in the weeks he had spent quietly building his case against Kessler, he had learned about her mother, about the little cat tin she had kept on the kitchen shelf through all the lean years of Cora's childhood, and that he had chosen that exact box on purpose because he knew that of all the hiding places in that house, it was the one thing she would never be able to walk past without opening. And the trail she had followed so brilliantly through the metadata, the altered timestamps, the address that pointed back to Kessler Group, the wall clock in the hotel footage, all of it, Ward confessed, had been laid down deliberately, not the careless mistakes of an overconfident enemy, but a path he had built one breadcrumb at a time for someone he trusted to find it, because he had known he might not survive to walk it himself. He had gathered the proof, hidden it where only the right person would look, and then he had made himself vanish, praying that the housekeeper with the accountant's eyes and the unbreakable spine would be curious enough and brave enough to pick up the thread he had left behind. And Cora understood at last that she had never truly been alone in that courtroom, that a man she had thought abandoned her had in fact placed his entire faith in her, without her ever knowing it. She crossed the space between them and wrapped her arms around Elias Ward, whispering a thank you for trusting her when she had not even trusted herself, and the old lawyer returned the embrace with awkward, grateful pats against her back, murmuring that it was he who should thank her, for proving that he had been right about her all along. 6 months later, Cora still had not grown used to the plaque on her office door that read Cora Bennett, Chief Financial Officer, and every time she passed it, she felt the quiet urge to pinch herself, because the housekeeper who once did not know where the cleaning supplies were kept, now had a corner office overlooking the Chicago skyline and a seat at the head of every meeting that mattered. In the months since that trial, Lucian Moretti had done exactly what he had told her he dreamed of doing on that cold night in his kitchen. He had taken everything his family had built and dragged it fully into the light, dissolving the old ways and founding a legitimate enterprise whose books were so clean that Cora, the woman who read numbers the way others read faces, had personally made certain of it. That morning, however, she had no time to admire the view, because Lucian had called a public event to announce the launch of the Moretti Foundation, a charity built to support the children of struggling neighborhoods like the one he had grown up in, and she was to be there as the company's chief financial officer, or so he had said. The hall was packed with investors and reporters and employees, and Cora stood at the side of the stage rehearsing figures she did not need to rehearse when Lucian stepped up to the microphone and, instead of speaking about the foundation, told the room that 6 months earlier he had sat in a courtroom about to lose everything, until a woman came stumbling through the door with crooked glasses and papers flying everywhere, and announced she was going to save him. Laughter rippled through the audience, and Cora felt her face go warm, and Lucian went on to say that he had thought she was out of her mind, and that perhaps she still was, but that she was also the bravest and most extraordinary person he had ever known, and then he turned toward the wings and asked her to come out and join him. Her heart stopped, but she walked out on unsteady legs, and when she reached his side he took her hand and told her, his voice soft now despite the microphones, that she had walked into his life on the worst day of it and turned everything he thought he knew upside down, that she had taught him trust was not a weakness, and then to her absolute shock he lowered himself to one knee and drew a small box from his jacket, and the entire hall drew a single breath. He said that he had spent his whole life building an empire, but that only when he met her did he understand what was actually worth building: a life, a home, a future. And he asked her whether she would marry him, and Cora, blinking back the sting in her eyes, managed to ask whether he had rehearsed all of that, or improvised it the way she had improvised her way through that trial. And Lucian laughed, his own eyes bright, and admitted that it was a little of both. She said yes, and the hall erupted, and as he rose to kiss her, Cora thought of the terrified young woman who had tripped through a courtroom door, with nothing but the truth in her hands, and no idea where she belonged. And she understood that the frightened girl was gone now, because at long last, she knew exactly where she belonged, in the arms of the man she had once saved, and who in every way that mattered, had saved her right back. If this story touched something in your heart, we would be so grateful if you would subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video with someone who loves stories of courage and second chances just as much as you do. We would truly love to know how this story made you feel, so please take a moment to leave a comment and share the thoughts that came to you as you listened, because every word you write means the world to us. Until next time, we wish you good health, a peaceful heart, and days filled with joy and kindness. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next story.